So I'm here with Miss Addie Kitchen, Miss Kat Brooks, Miss Hallie McKelvey, and Miss Latifah Simon to urge the governor to sign Assembly Bill 2054. AB 2054 would establish the Community Response Initiative to Strengthen Emergency Systems, also known as the CRISES Act. It is a pilot program to scale up community-based organizations as first responders. Interactions with police can induce terror in many people who historically have been traumatized by law enforcement. Too often, these interactions are deadly. Too often, people just want solutions to their problems. They just want an emergency or a crisis solved, but they are afraid to call the police because of the potential consequences. Police kill people with untreated mental health conditions, such as schizophrenia, 16 times more often than people without mental health issues. Police violence also is a leading cause of death for young Black men. COVID-19 has many side effects, including significant challenges to people's mental health. This pandemic only has strengthened the need for and the importance of this bill. About 1,144 of 2,296 San Francisco Police Department officers have received 40 hours of mental health crisis intervention training, according to the San Francisco Police Department. Many officers have undergone even less training. So why would we be putting the mental health and the lives and security of people in their hands? But organizations like Mental Health First in Sacramento that already respond successfully to situations involving people with mental health challenges and other issues are staffed by trained professionals who have dedicated their lives to mental health work. In cities across the state, community organizations provide humane and germane crisis response with pathways for long-term healing rather than incarcerating and then releasing the person in crisis without resources for long-term help, thus creating a never-ending cycle. The governor has characterized the opportunity to alter police responsibilities as long overdue. Those were his words. He has said, why are we burdening law enforcement in the first place with these responsibilities? I agree. We agree. AB 2054 marshals an array of experienced community organizations equipped to step in as first responders. Other state and federal legislators regard this legislation as a model. In fact, AB 2054 has inspired Los Angeles Congresswoman, my Congresswoman, Karen Bass, and Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen to introduce similar legislation at the federal level. We have an opportunity right now in California to move away from the tired status quo that results in the shooting of unarmed Black men and women, and that drove hundreds of thousands of people into the streets to protest during a pandemic. I hope we have the courage to take it. You're on mute, Alina, but we're gonna move into.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember. Next up, we have Addie Kitchen, grandmother of Stephen Taylor, who was killed by San Leandro police on April 18th, 2020.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Stephen Taylor was my grandson. I raised him. His mother was strung out, him and his two brothers. And he also got strung out, and so he became homeless. I was in denial when I saw the picture of him dying on the floor in Walmart, and didn't know what to do, where to go, who to talk to. But you know, people showed up and kind of helped me through this crisis. He was going through a mental crisis. They called the police on him. They shot him. They killed him right there in Walmart. There was no help. No one could see that he was going through a crisis. And I don't know, San Leandro doesn't have, as far as I know, they don't have mental health crises for homeless people. And so this has truly devastated the family. His brothers are having a real hard time just trying to get over the fact that he was murdered. He has two sons who's really, they're 11 years old, and they are just unbelievably overwhelmed. I mean, one of the little boys went to the barbershop to have his hair cut, and he just acted horrible. And his mom had to take him out and took him home and asked him what was going on. He said he was afraid the police were going to kill him. 11 years old. What do I say? How do we help these young kids? And these are two young Black kids, to get them to understand that all police aren't bad. But again, we have to give them that speech every day when they go out, how they're supposed to respond. And that's not fair to our children. So, you know, Governor Newsom, please help us. We're all in a crisis. The families are in a crisis because of what happened. I see a counselor because I'm still just trying to get my head on right that they literally murdered my grandson in Walmart full of people and nobody was there to help him. That should never have happened. He had a bat, but does the bat have to cause the police to murder him? He didn't threaten anybody, but they murdered him. And San Leandro, the city council, the police department are horrible people. The only way we knew that it happened is the coroner calls his mother at 1 o'clock in the morning and said, yes, that's Stephen Taylor. They never called us to identify the body. He was murdered on the 18th of April. We saw him in May at a viewing because of the COVID. We couldn't have a funeral. We were only allowed 10 family members in the mortuary. That is just so hard to get over because the man was murdered on the 18th and we never got a chance to see him until we had to put him away. And that's not nobody should have to go through that, not anybody. So, you know, the San Leandro they're not, we were fortunate enough that the DA decided to press charges on this officer. Where it's going to go from here, we don't know. We're hoping and praying that he'll be found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. That's as much as we could get. So we're still fighting and protesting and doing everything that we can to make sure that maybe it won't happen to anybody else. That's our hope, is that it won't happen to anybody else. Nobody in the world should have to go through losing someone by the police. You know, if he'd have died of COVID, it wouldn't have been so hard. If he'd have died because he got hit by a car, that wouldn't have been so hard. But when the police, and they're supposed to protect us, are murdering us because we're Black, because we're poor, because we're homeless, because we're going through a mental crisis, we need help. We need help, and just praying that the governor will understand what we're going through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Addie. Next up, we have Hallie McKelvey, daughter of Myra Michelizio, who was killed by a Butte County Sheriff's deputy on April 28th in 2018. Myra also was a home care worker and member of UDW AFSCME, who also is a co-sponsor of the CRISES Act.
Good morning, all. First off, thank you again for providing the space to have this conversation. My mother was killed, as Alina shared, on April 28th, April 26th, my apologies, 2018 in Butte County, California. My mother was in a psychosis and found herself on a property that she believed in her crisis, her belongings were there. And after an interaction with the homeowner who called 911, 2 sheriff deputies responded to the scene. And within 11 seconds of them arriving at the scene, from the time that they got out of the vehicle to the time that my mother was murdered with 11 bullets riddled inside of her, it took 11 seconds. That law enforcement agency didn't show up to serve and protect that day. That law enforcement agency showed up and murdered my mother, who was in a mental health crisis, who took one look at her and put a bias and said, this woman is a threat and she's a threat to society and it's my call to kill her. Both officers shot their guns. One officer, it was proven that it was just one officer's bullets that had killed my mother, who had cleared through her chest, through the back of her vehicle. And I'm bringing these points up because these are conversations no one should ever have. As Ms. Kitchen eloquently talked about, we are now members, we have a membership to this club that no one wants a membership to. It's not a badge of honor that my mother was murdered by the Butte County Sheriff's Department. It's not a badge of honor to Ms. Kitchen and the rest of her family and the rest of us who are suffering through the reality. This is horror. This is hell. I wish there was somebody on site. I wish there was some form of intervention that could identify my mother's mental health crisis versus the assumption that she was going to harm someone. And I try to speak very eloquently on this topic, but the pain and the anger is still alive, is still thriving. I know California has been working very hard to champion this cause with different introductions into legislative bills, with AB 392 that went into effect in January of this year, and now accompanying, this opportunity for a pilot program. Law enforcement response to these crises, to homelessness, to somebody's skin color, to somebody's mental health behavior, is resulting in murder. And I'm going to reiterate that. And even though it's all out in the open in 2020 and everything that we're seeing on the streets, the trauma response to the realities of our communities, to the reality of Black individuals, to reality of my mother who was mentally ill, her life had a value. She had a value. She brought value and care to many people. My mother was a in-home healthcare provider. As stated, she was a member of the UDW, and she provided for the elders from her local Kingdom Hall. My mother was a Jehovah's Witness, and she provided in-home care for the elders from the congregation, and she brought quality. When I spoke to the families of those who she took care of after her death and got to connect with what her community looked like in California and within Butte County, there was beauty, there was asset. She was a charming woman. She was very willing to help others in spite of the barriers put in front of her. She was willing to go above and beyond to make sure there was nurture and care. And that was stolen. That was stolen from my family. That was stolen, my mother's life, her pulse, her heartbeat, ripped away in 11 seconds. Why? Why? That is something that I cannot, and I replay the day, I replay the information that I have, all of the recreation videos from the scene of the crime, because, my mother was the criminal in this case. There was no due process. Law enforcement's not equipped to respond to mental health crisis. And if they're only getting 40 hours in the big picture of what they do and what we as a society are trained to trust in them to do, and they're coming and killing those instead of providing the treatment, we need to move away from this model. And this is why I am on this call today, to plead that, okay, if we can get the funds, if we can get this passed by Governor Newsom and put the funds and put this into play in communities, and we're asking just for a pilot. We're asking to see if this works, because the current model is not working. The current model is killing us, and then there's the residual effects that the family members and community members have to live with. I have children. I live in a very rural area. I am not where my mother was murdered, but I have a son who has questions. How do I treat law enforcement? How do I behave? These are the things that should never be in my realm. This should have never happened, but this narrative was brought to my doorstep, my siblings' doorstep, our extended family's doorstep on the evening of April 26, 2018. Something's wrong with that. Something's wrong with everything that we are seeing. And all that I ask to Governor Newsom is, please look into the family's eyes when we're talking to you. Please listen to the words that we are stating. Please just jump on board and give this a shot, because the current model is not worth all the lives littered on the streets because of law enforcement trigger happy. Something needs to be done, and that's that's all I have to say. I'm very grateful that there are so many people who are willing to work on this and willing to come together and identify the crisis. And Ms. Kitchen, I just want to thank you for the words that you said before me, because listening about your grandson in Walmart, the atrocity of that, it interlines with the visual that I have of my own mother's murder and what had to have been going through her mind in those 11 seconds. And I want to reiterate, this wasn't 11 seconds to get my gun out and do what I need to do to shoot. It was from the time that that deputy stepped foot on that soil to the time that she was dead. It was 11 seconds. Unnecessary.
It took him 40 seconds to kill Stephen. 40 seconds. So when that officer walked in and saw he was Black and homeless, he already had in his mind what he needed to do. He didn't think about, maybe let me step back. In his mind, he was ready to murder. And that's ridiculous. 40 seconds, 11 seconds. I mean, my God.
Yes, ma'am. And there was no intervention. There was no talking to my mother. There was no, Miss Michaelizio, what is going on? They just took what was said through the intervening call that was dispatched out, showed up, had the guns ready, killed her, a life. We've watched, I don't want to go too far out, but we're watching in live time, George Floyd, all of these other incidences across the nation. And it's a standard normal of society now that we get to watch murders in cold blood and then stand back and feel powerless.
Yeah.
Something's wrong with that.
I know, it's like turning on your television, watching the news. You turn on the TV and it happens every day. And so it's just, is that normal?
And that has become the new normal. And then until you're in my situation or Miss Kitchen's situation or the other countless family situations, it's really hard to reconcile that. It's really hard to say, you know what, I do understand things happen and maybe somebody is breaking the law, but that's why we have the due process in America. That is not for law enforcement to intervene and say, okay, you know what, I'm the judge and jury and I get to do everything I need to do. That is why we have a due process. But this model, again, reframing this whole situation, this isn't working. And if we can get the Crisis Act as a pilot program in these communities and just see the potential, and having the skilled trauma-informed interventionalists to come through, whether it's the mental health professional, whether it's someone from a homelessness program that can say, let me help get him or her off the street. What does this look like? What if, do they need the basic needs of humanity? Do they need shelter? Do they need food? Why? It doesn't matter the why, because whatever the why is, a lot of us, our family members are still resulting in murder from law enforcement, and then our hands are tied. I just please ask that, I'm sorry for my rant, but I do just please ask that we are heard, that my story can represent and that maybe help just one life through this crisis pilot program. And that's all I'm asking. And I just want to say chi miigwech. And Ms. Kitchen, I'm so happy that we were able to do this, and I'd love to be in touch with you behind the scenes.
Thank you so much, Hallie. Next up, we have Latifah Simon, who is a member of the BART Board of Directors.
Thank you so much. I come to this virtual small gathering today as an elected. I know that I have a number of the honor of serving in many different capacities in community. I'm the current president of the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and these words are my own. I'm in deep support of 2054, and I'm in deep appreciation to these amazing families who truly deeply believe in democracy, the rule of law, of blind justice. I'm extremely proud to have representation in Sacramento. Ms. Kamlager is carrying the voices of so many folks and believes so much absolutely in this idea that democracy and the rule of law should be real. And what 2054 does for the family members who are represented on this call and to folks like me, when I was 21, lost my very best friend in San Francisco who was shot 33 times by San Francisco PD during a mental health episode. And I will not say his name. That's his mother's right. But we know that things could have gone differently. And what 2054 does, and as you read the legislation, it is truly a love letter to possibility, an idea that communities can keep one another safe, that local community-based organizations and trained professionals in selected communities, if given the resource and the opportunity, can become an additional force to create safety in communities. We know, and someone like me who worked for most of my career working with young people in the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system, their first interaction with law enforcement when they are struggling through systems shouldn't be violent. If a young person is having a very difficult time, if young people are escaping their own homes through domestic violence, if folks are dealing in the streets with the realities of the many things that we know that folks are dealing with addiction and homelessness, what 2054 provides us, this love letter, this pathway, is an opportunity to test out what we know is already true. That communities day in and day out are on the streets, are working with folks, and unfortunately, many of them are doing it with no resource. I want to thank folks like Kat Brooks from ATPT, who's been saying this for years, who has been training organizations and individuals and mental health care workers of how to work with folks in precarious situations. Oftentimes we know that when folks are in crisis, the last thing we need is a badge, a shield, and a gun. That we need caring folks who understand de-escalation, we need to be involving community, and that 911 oftentimes should not be the only option to bring communities together when they are in crisis. I want to thank you all so much. And again, from the bottom of my heart, and you know, I've been on the phone to the GO and other folks who have been supporting, again, this love letter to possibility and a true public safety. You all have come together really to offer the state an opportunity to advance the transformation of a public safety system that we know is in need of deep, deep transformation. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Latifah. I haven't heard the bill described as a love letter to possibility, but I think that's how I'm going to describe it from now on. Next up, we have Kat Brooks, who is co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project and executive director of Justice Teams Network.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Assemblymember Kamlager, for carrying this crucial legislation. We heard from family members this morning on this press conference, and right before I was here with you all, I'm speaking with the mother of Ton Hall, whose son Miles Hall was gunned down by the Walnut Creek Police Department in 2019 in the middle of a mental health crisis. And part of why her story sits with me in particular ways is because they did everything they thought they were supposed to do. They had established relationships with the police department. The police department knew Miles. They knew what his condition was. They were sure to follow the instructions that the police gave them. This is what you're supposed to say when you call Miles in crisis. Every box they ticked off. And still and yet, when Miles was in crisis and Miles needed compassion and care, and the only phone number that that family had to call was 911, again within seconds, as Miles was trying to run home for safety, he ended up dead. 1 in 4 people killed by law enforcement in this country are in the middle of a mental health crisis. 1 in 4. And that's just the most egregious, right, outcome. That when you look at the levels of beatings, of involuntary incarceration, of all of the other damage that is done, when we continue to send badges and guns instead of compassion and care, there's a crisis that is facing our community, which really is why this bill is so aptly named, right? The Crisis Act. But this is community response to community crisis. And to Latifah's point, we are already doing this. We are on the ground. There are grassroots organizations like my own Anti-Police Terror Project, where we are running these programs on shoestring budgets out of the generous hearts of volunteers, because we're clear that we're tired of our community members dying. We are in a particular political moment. One of the conversations I had with Ms. Hall this morning also was a year ago, it felt like we were screaming into the wind that we needed these alternative responses, that we kept saying the same thing over and over and over again, and nobody was listening to us. Finally, people are listening. And when you talk to communities, when you're in the streets, people are supportive of this idea. They actually want law enforcement to be freed up to do the other things that they want law enforcement to do. But the way that we have it set up, law enforcement is the answer to every single social ill we have, and it's simply not working. In this political moment, California has an opportunity to be a vanguard. We have an opportunity to show the rest of the country that this is how you do it. This is how you solve, this is how you take care of your constituents. This is how you take care of your people. This is how we destigmatize and decriminalize mental health. Mental health crisis is not a crime. Having a mental health diagnosis is not a crime, and it certainly should not be a death sentence. And what's even more important, in addition to Governor Newsom signing this piece of legislation, is that it does not go into the hands of law enforcement agencies in order to control it. They've had their chance, and they've demonstrated that this is just not what they're equipped to do, right? Law enforcement is taught to neutralize the threat with force. And if you're dealing with someone who may not be in our shared reality, or you're dealing with someone who's in extreme hysteria or emotion, barking commands at them and neutralizing them and trying to force compliance is not going to get any of us to where we need to be. This bill will save lives, it will save money, and it needs to be in the hands of the experts, which are the community members. Those that are closest to the problem are the ones that have the solution. We need this bill. We need it now. And it will only, I mentioned that California is a vanguard. It's not just going to save lives in California, because what I know, because I've been doing this work for over a decade, is that when we move in a particular way around criminal justice reform, the country moves in a particular way around criminal justice reform. So we're not just talking about saving lives in Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles. We're talking about saving lives across the country. Governor Newsom made promises to us on the campaign trail and when he came into office about what he was going to do around criminal justice reform. This is a no-brainer. This is an easy win. This should be simple, and it should happen right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. Assemblymember, did you want to just wrap us up before we take questions from any reporters on the line?
Sure. I want to just thank everyone for joining this press conference and speaking their truth. Kat and Latifah have been on the front lines of this issue for many, many years, and Ms. Kitchen and Hallie have really shared their stories, and in the memory of Stephen and in the memory of Myra and in the memory of so many other family members who have suffered under the hands of law enforcement, it is beyond time for Governor Newsom to pass AB 2054. We shouldn't really have to have families begging for this kind of reimagining. I do want to add that 8% of calls in Los Angeles to 911 are calls to law enforcement about a violent activity. The majority of the calls that come into 911 are nonviolent or non-criminal in nature. AB 2054 actually says that mental health episodes, that poverty, that homelessness are not crimes, and as such should not be treated that way. And AB 2054 is an honest need for care, because that is why people are calling. Most of the folks who actually call 911 are also not calling 911 asking for law enforcement to come and kill someone. But everyone in this scenario is asking for support, is asking for some kind of resolution, de-escalation, or solution to a problem or a crisis that they are facing. Ultimately, as you're hearing from this press conference and so many others, this is really about the fact that these scenarios have eviscerated the trust that communities want to have with law enforcement. But instead of building or nurturing that trust, in fact, what you have is generations sort of bleeding trauma and pain because of an episode that didn't have to happen. And so AB 2054 is really an opportunity for California to put our money where our values claim to be. It was a bipartisan bill. It got bipartisan support. It had almost unanimous support on both houses. There is no reason why this bill should be held up. There's no reason why this bill should be vetoed. And there is no reason why this bill should not go fully funded into action once it's signed.
Thank you, Assemblymember. We will now take questions from members of the press. Please note that you have a question in the chat box and I will unmute you. I'm going to go to Joyce Cutler from Bloomberg Law so you can ask your question. Go ahead, Joy.
Hi, this is Joyce Cutler with Bloomberg Law. Has Governor given any indication whether he'll sign the bill or any indication of any objections to it?
So we have not heard yet. Obviously we're all waiting. We're waiting until the end of the month. We have been in conversations with his office. We had been during the course of the journey of this bill. And there were a number of discussions about funding, obviously in a time of COVID. There were also questions about, if the Office of Emergency Services has the capacity to manage this kind of initiative, given the fact that they're also burdened with COVID and the wildfires. So we were adamant that it stay in OES and that it not be shifted to another department that maybe doesn't understand why it's important for this to be removed from a law enforcement agency and to be given a different kind of perspective and lens through which grant proposals are approved and funds are distributed and support is given to community-based organizations who are in these neighborhoods and communities and doing the work. So we haven't heard that he's planning to sign the bill. We are hoping that he does. That's why we're doing this press conference. But there had been indications that there were some concerns with the funding. I will add it's low. It's $3 million over a year over the course of 3 years for this pilot initiative. So in the scheme of things, it's budget dust, as they like to say.
Do we have any other questions? Give it a minute.
I also want to add that just today in the Los Angeles Times, there was an article about a young man, Eric Braceno, who was killed by sheriffs in Los Angeles. Earlier this month or late last month, there was an article that made national news about the death of Daniel Prude. In each of these instances, like so many of the instances you're hearing through stories by family members, there's someone in a mental health moment and the person who's calling 911 is really just asking for a de-escalation of a mental health episode. And we should not be having our newspapers and our sound wave littered with these traumatic stories of death and despair at the hands of law enforcement.
Okay, thank you, Assemblymember, and thank you, everybody. It looks like all questions have been answered. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. You can reach out to me, Alina Evans, in Assemblymember Kamlager's office with any follow-up questions. We will now end the live stream, but the video will remain on Facebook. And for any members of the media, we do have a video of the live stream recorded and can send clips via downloadable files. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.